The story you were taught about Central Africa begins with Europe arriving. That story is a lie, and the evidence to prove it has been sitting in European museums for over a century. Here is the version they needed you to believe. Somewhere in the dense interior of Central Africa, scattered, isolated villages existed in timeless stasis. No cities, no states, no memory, no record. People who had not yet entered history. People who, in the logic of what came next, could therefore be removed from the earth without history noticing. That story was not a gap in the scholarship. It was a construction, and the construction had a price tag. You can still hear it in the words people use without thinking. Tribal, primitive, prehistoric. Words dropped like dust over cities, royal courts, furnaces, trade roads, burial fields, and archives of memory that were never meant to survive the story written over them. But there is a problem with that familiar version. It breaks the moment you touch the evidence. In Lisbon, inside the Museu Nacional de Arqueologia, there are small shells that do not look powerful at first. They are pale, smooth, spiral-ridged, the kind of object a person might brush aside if they did not know what they were looking at. They are called Nzimbu, and in the Kingdom of Kongo, these shells were not decoration. They were money, not symbolic money, not casual village exchange. Standardized currency, harvested under royal monopoly, graded by size and quality under state supervision, and circulated across an economy that stretched more than 300,000 square kilometers. The hoards found at excavation sites in Mbanza, Congo, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Angola, show accumulations consistent not with personal wealth but with state treasury reserves. Controlled, counted, regulated. A society does not create regulated currency because it is simple. It creates regulated currency because exchange has become too large for memory alone. This was the currency of the Kingdom of Kongo, functioning as a monetary economy at least 2 centuries before Portuguese ships reached its coast. When those ships arrived in 1483, they did not discover a wilderness. They arrived at a capital city that archaeologists now estimate held 100,000 inhabitants, which would have made Mbanza, Congo, one of the largest cities on Earth at that moment. Larger than London, comparable to Paris, roads led outward from that plateau in what is now Angola. Messengers carried orders. Markets moved with cloth, iron, salt, copper, ivory, and shells counted with the precision of a treasury. That is the first crack in the familiar version, and once it opens, the question becomes more dangerous. What else was hidden? The Portuguese royal chronicler João de Barros recorded in his Décadas do Asia in 1552 what those first expeditionary sailors actually found when they came ashore. A functioning royal court, a system of provincial governors, a tax collection infrastructure, and a king, Nzinga, a Ntinu, who received them as one sovereign receives the emissary of another. De Barros was not writing propaganda for Africa. He was writing official Portuguese state history, and even official Portuguese state history could not disguise what the expedition had encountered: a state, a peer, an equal. That diplomatic recognition was formalized in the years that followed. The Kingdom of Kongo and Portugal exchanged resident ambassadors. They corresponded in writing, in multiple languages. Congolese diplomats traveled to Lisbon. And the Congolese king Afonso I wrote letters to the King of Portugal in 1526, letters that survive in the Portuguese National Archives, formally protesting the illegal capture of his subjects for the slave trade, describing it in the language of international law between sovereign nations. Read that again. A Central African king protested the slave trade in writing to the King of Portugal, citing the rights of his subjects as citizens of a recognized state. That letter exists. It has always existed. It is not taught. When Europeans wanted trade, they recognized Congo as a state. When Europeans wanted bodies, the language changed. The facts did not shrink. The usefulness of admitting them did. The contradiction sits in the archive like a blade left on a table. The same political structures the Portuguese called provinces and courts and governors in the 1490s were reclassified, in church records and official documents, as chieftaincies and tribes, as the slave trade deepened across the 16th and 17th centuries. The reclassification was not scholarly revision. It was legal engineering. A chieftaincy could not produce citizens with rights. A tribe could not protest the enslavement of its members under international law. By changing the word, they changed what the violence meant. The archaeological zone at Mbanza, Kongo still holds traces of foundation walls, royal spaces, and elite burial structures in Uige province, Angola. Stone and earth remain where a capital once stood. A city does not leave foundations because it was imaginary. If you have never been taught in a classroom that the Kingdom of Kongo sent diplomatic missions to Europe and wrote formal protests to European kings, type the word sovereign in the comments right now. Now move away from the coast, into the interior worlds Europeans barely understood. In the Luba world of the central Congo basin, power was not held together only by force. It was held together by memory. Inside the Detroit Institute of Arts and inside the Royal Museum for Central Africa in Tervuren, Belgium, there are Luba objects known as Lukasa, small enough to hold in 2 hands, their surfaces arranged with beads, shells, and carved patterns that look almost abstract to someone not trained to read them. But to Luba court historians called the Mbudai, these were not decorative objects. They were archives. A Lukasa could encode royal genealogies, records of territorial boundaries, accounts of military campaigns, constitutional succession rules, sacred sites, and the logic of political alliance. It was a record system that asked the trained historian to move through the past with their fingertips. So when a textbook says Central Africa lacked writing, listen carefully to what is being smuggled into that sentence. It is not only saying people used different systems. It is suggesting that only one kind of record counts as intelligence. But the Luba remembered differently. They stored knowledge differently. And that difference was later used against them by people who mistook their own ignorance for African absence. The Mbudai historians were trained specialists constituting, in effect, a state archival service, an institutionalized information storage and political memory system operating across one of the largest empires in Central Africa from at least the 13th century. Those boards were later collected by Belgian colonial administrators, packed into crates, shipped to Tervuren, placed behind glass, labeled as decorative objects, and displayed to European visitors as evidence of how charming and primitive the Congolese were. The same institution that housed those boards was built by the man responsible for their people's destruction. King Leopold II of Belgium acquired the Congo Free State as his personal property in 1885 following the Berlin Conference, at which European powers divided the African continent among themselves without inviting a single African representative. What Leopold extracted from the Congo over the next 23 years, rubber, ivory, forced labor, severed hands, killed an estimated 10 million people. The atrocity required a justification, and the justification required an idea, that the people being killed had never had a civilization worth the name, that the land had been empty of meaningful human development, that Leopold was not destroying something. He was, in the language of the time, building something in a space where nothing had previously existed. The museum he built in Tervuren in 1897 was the architecture of that idea. It was not a neutral institution that happened to have biases. It was a propaganda instrument, funded by colonial extraction, designed to make a lie look like scholarship. Objects from Central Africa entered glass cases, but their meanings were stripped behind colonial labels. Power became craft, political systems became folklore. Evidence of complexity was not always destroyed. Sometimes it was simply displayed in a way that made it harmless. That may be the cruelest kind of erasure, not burning the artifact, teaching people to look at it and see nothing. The Tervuren Museum held the Lukasa. It also held the Katanga Cross copper ingots, standardized X-shaped pieces found in elite burials at the Sanga and Mungkamba sites in Katanga province, carbon dated to the 8th and 9th centuries CE. These ingots were not jewelry. Their surfaces carry the mute authority of metal shaped to a standard, dug, smelted, cast, carried, exchanged, and buried with elites across a trans-regional copper trade economy that had been operating in the Central African interior long before any Arab or European commercial presence in that zone. A copper cross in an elite grave is not just metal, it is the signature of a system. The Royal Museum for Central Africa did not undergo its first serious attempt at decolonial reinterpretation of its permanent collection until 2018, 121 years after it opened. Somewhere a child sits in a classroom with a map of Africa on the wall. The teacher moves quickly past the center of the continent. Egypt gets pyramids, Greece gets philosophy, Rome gets law, Europe gets kings and voyages and invention. The child waits for the Congo, it never comes. Years later, that same child may walk through a museum and see a Lukasa board under glass, or a copper cross in a case, or a shell currency hoard described in small print. And something quiet happens, not anger at first, something closer to grief. The realization that the empty space in the lesson was not empty at all. Someone made it empty. That emptiness was manufactured by a layered apparatus. Before Leopold, before the racial scientists, the erasure had an earlier, quieter form. The Portuguese and Catholic Church's semantic reclassification of Congo from sovereign partner to extractable territory. Then the 19th century academic tradition of racial science, Blumenbach, Cuvier, Morgan, constructed a formal, published, university-certified hierarchy of civilizational development that placed sub-Saharan Africans at the bottom. Their frameworks were not fringe opinions. They were adopted into encyclopedias, integrated into curricula across Europe and America, and became the interpretive lens through which African archaeological evidence was evaluated, or refused evaluation, for over 150 years. The framework had already decided what the evidence could mean before the evidence was allowed to speak. This three-phase mechanism, diplomatic reclassification to enable the slave trade, scientific codification to justify colonization, institutional architecture to make the erasure permanent, did not happen by accident. The transatlantic slave trade removed an estimated 12.5 million people from Africa between 1500 and 1900. That enterprise could not survive public acknowledgement that those people were citizens of organized, sophisticated states. The idea of African primitiveness was manufactured, maintained, and funded because the alternative, the truth, would have made the entire enterprise impossible to sustain. Return now to the record, and the silence fills with names. The Luba and Lunda empires of the central interior operated hereditary kingship systems. The Bulapwi, with formal constitutional succession rules, territorial administration, and interregional diplomacy for at least 3 centuries before European contact. This is not oral tradition speculation. It is the documented conclusion of Jan Vansena, the Belgian-American historian who spent decades cross-referencing linguistic evidence, archaeological records, and oral history to reconstruct the political architecture of these kingdoms in his 1966 work Kingdoms of the Savannah. Vansena's methodology gave the academic world no credible reason to dismiss his findings. The findings were acknowledged in specialist literature, and then, outside that literature, quietly ignored. And then there is the fire. In the Kagera region of northwestern Tanzania, near the border where the Great Lakes Territory meets the Congo drainage basin, archaeologist Peter Schmidt and archaeometallurgist Donald Avery excavated iron smelting furnace sites in the 1970s. Imagine those furnaces before the excavation. Clay walls darkened by heat, charcoal packed inside, air forced through the chamber, temperatures rising until stone gives up metal. The workers around them were not guessing. They understood the behavior of flame, air, ore, and time across generations of accumulated knowledge. What the carbon dating returned was not what anyone in the Western academic establishment was prepared for. 500 BCE. The metallurgists of this region were constructing preheated, forced draft furnaces that produced medium carbon steel 2,500 years ago. Schmidt and Avery published their findings in Science in 1981. The paper is peer-reviewed. It is not disputed by the relevant specialists. The thermodynamic principle these furnace builders independently engineered, introducing preheated oxygen into the smelting process to increase furnace temperature beyond what standard bellows could achieve, is the same principle that Henry Bessemer patented in England in 1856, which the Western world credits as the foundation of the industrial steel age. The Buhaya furnaces predate that moment by approximately 2,400 years. The people the museum in Tervuren displayed as pre-civilizational had been engineering advanced metallurgy, while Rome was still a collection of villages on 7 hills. This is a statement about the archaeological record, which has been available, verified, and ignored. The actual story is not that Central Africa had to become visible through Europe. The actual story is that Europe arrived late to societies already visible to themselves. The Nzimbu shells are still in Lisbon. The Mbanza Kongo Foundation walls still stand in Angola. The Buhaya furnaces still exist in Tanzania. The Lukasa boards are still in Detroit and Tervuren. The Katanga cross ingots are still in the Tervuren cases. None of this evidence appeared after some new discovery. It was always there, labeled incorrectly, contextualized misleadingly, or left in storage while the story that needed to be told about Africa was told without it. Go back to those Nzimbu shells. Hold them in the mind's eye, small, pale, spiral-ridged, polished, smooth. They came from a coastline near Luanda. They passed through the hands of royal treasury officials. They moved through markets across a territory larger than modern France. They are not symbolic. They are not decorative. They are the physical residue of a state that was already functioning, already complex, already centuries deep in its own history when foreign ships turned the coast into a wound. The shells did not stop being currency because someone called them beads. The kingdom did not stop being a kingdom because someone called it a tribe. The steel did not stop being steel because the furnace that made it was inconvenient to the story. And the people who were taken, 12.5 million of them, across 4 centuries, did not stop being citizens of organized societies because the institution built to justify their taking said otherwise. The blank space on the old maps was never proof of absence. It was proof of the mapmaker's agenda. So when someone tells you Central Africa had no history before the first slave ship, ask them why a land without history needed so many institutions to erase it. This is Dark Timeline. The series continues with the histories buried under empire, museum glass, and classroom silence. Subscribe and follow the evidence back.